Holly. I'm with Karen. I'm really excited that you all are here. This has been quite a journey to get you all here, so it's really wonderful to see you. I want to invite our moderator, Isadora Key, who works with me at CARE. She's our General Emergency Advisor, and she's going to be the moderator for the two panels. And so, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. How are you feeling today?
Great.
Yeah? Good? I am a gender and emergencies person, so I need to learn some acronyms for cash-based transfer. Give me some acronyms. Go on. Cash people, give me some acronyms.
CBT.
CBT.
CBI.
CBI.
FSD.
Wow, okay, I have no idea what you're talking about. Gender people, give me some great acronyms. We've got some really good ones on gender-based violence in particular. GBV, yeah. SGBV, VAM, yep. IPV, SOPs. Cash people, do you understand a word of what we're saying?
SOPs, we understand.
Okay. One of the ways we're going to address the knowledge gap today is by speaking to each other in language we can understand. We are really lucky and fortunate to bring together specialists from cash and gender, but we don't really speak the same language. So imagine your grandmother is in the room with us today. Speak normal, recognizable words, and we should be fine. It's fantastic to have lots of cash and gender people here today. I would like to see who is in the room. So if you are a cash person, could you stand up? Oh, you're coming. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a look around. It's quite a lot of you. It's very exciting. Please sit down. You know what's coming. If you're a cash and gender person, please stand up. Wow. Rashid, you can get up. Thank you. And if you're a gender person or a gender-based violence person, please stand up. There's some of us in the room. Hello. Be mindful, we've got really that diversity is going to be the great strength of this conversation, but as I said, we're all trying to bridge this gap. The two panels we're about to have this afternoon are around knowledge and practice. So I'd like to invite our first set of knowledge-based panelists to come up to the stage, please. We have Daphne, Tenzin, and Jenny. Perfect. Wonderful. The way both panels is going to work is pretty simple. We're going to have three panelists. They're going to talk for about 5 to 7 minutes. You can time them on your watches if you really want to. After we've listened to all three interventions, we're going to open the floor for questions and comments and interventions and thoughts. We're all learning in this together, so do share. I'm going to pass over to our very first speaker, which is Daphne from International Rescue Committee. I was going to try and get my acronym right. IRC. Daphne, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks. So I stood up as a cash and gender person. I am at the International Rescue Committee as the policy lead on our economic programmes, but I'm also the co-chair of the UK Gender and Development Network, so I feel like I stand in both camps, and I'm really delighted to be here and for CaLP to be hosting this important event as the kick-off to Cash Week this week. I'd like to talk very briefly about some of our upcoming research or ongoing research at the International Rescue Committee focused on gender. Just overall, I'd like to emphasise that the IRC is committed to narrowing gender inequalities across its programming and addressing both physical, psychological and sexual violence and promoting women's economic empowerment. So I hope to talk to you about research that seeks to achieve a reduction in GBV, but also is looking at how to improve the delivery of cash transfers to make them safer. Areas that we're also exploring that I won't talk about at such length today is how to do that transformative programming that Karen was referring to. So moving beyond gender responsive programming to gender transformative programming. And I'm looking forward to much more discussion about that. How can we raise the bar for cash from beyond the bare minimum on gender to really pursue economic empowerment and gender transformative impacts. So I won't go over the evidence that Karen summarised that's all in the papers, really excited to cover those, but as we know, the evidence is quite mixed. We know about the cash's potential to reduce gender inequalities, to boost women's self-confidence, increase their household decision-making and reduce finance-related household tensions, but that is mixed evidence. And also there's a dearth of evidence, particularly in humanitarian settings. And so we're exploring expanding that evidence as part of the IRC commitment to increase cash-based programming to 25% of our humanitarian assistance by 2020. I also know that you know that in acute emergencies and in a lot of the contexts that you work in, that women are particularly vulnerable to a range of risks. And what we need to have is an improved understanding of how to reduce those risks, but also how to transform those relations that make them vulnerable, the root causes of those relations that make them vulnerable to the risks in the first place. So I'm going to start by talking about our research that's part of our What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls in Conflict programme, and I should also emphasise that I have colleagues in the room who are leading on this research, so when it comes to the discussion I'm really looking forward to their contributions as well. So the question in the What Works research was, what is the change over time on women's experience of violence, negative coping and well-being before and after receiving cash? So there was a survey of women in Raqqa, Syria, in an acute emergency context, immediately before receiving a 3-month cash transfer and immediately after. The women that were surveyed, the majority of them had been displaced at least once. 91% of the respondents had been displaced. A quarter of them had at least one family member that had been killed. A fifth had a family member that was missing, and 55% had experienced intimate partner violence. So these were women, the women that were surveyed were particularly vulnerable and had already experienced a large amount of trauma and displacement. So the results of the surveys are coming in. So what I want to do today is talk to you about the challenges of doing research like that in contexts like that. The original survey was conducted in March, and the end line was conducted in August. So as I said, we're analysing the results at the moment. But what we have to balance as practitioners that are doing research in emergency contexts is the risks exposed to the people that we serve, but also to the programming that we deliver. And that's something that we experienced in the Syria context. We understood certain sensitivities of the research that we were doing at the outset. We understood that there was likely to be a lot of underreporting, particularly of sexual exploitation and abuse. That was no surprise to us. And we tried to mitigate the reality of that and to address that by using smartphone technology and audio-assisted interview methods to minimise underreporting and protect the participant's identity. That was particularly important to us. But what we also experienced is after the baseline survey had taken place, that the military authorities were very concerned about the potential research and were very sensitive about the research questions that were being asked, and wanted to have a lot of influence over the questions that were being asked. So there was a lot of scrutiny over our research, and what we had to balance was the risks both to the programming that we're delivering. We are the only GBV providers in that region of Raqqa and Syria, as well as the people that we work with as well, so the risks that they were facing. So they actually asked us to remove questions on sexual exploitation and abuse from the end line before we came to that survey, and we made a decision that that was the right thing to do so we could continue to deliver those services. So I just wanted to emphasise that as a point of the realities of doing research on gender issues, in particularly in acute emergencies, but a lot of the contexts we work in. We're not just doing the research, we're delivering the programming, and those are essential programmes that people rely on. Nevertheless, it's hoped that the research will provide very important insights that will be valuable in understanding the potential for cash to reduce GBV, broader women's safety and protection and empowerment concerns. So whilst that was research on achieving GBV outcomes, the other research I'd like to talk to you about is the research we've done on making the delivery of cash safer, our Safer Cash research that's carried out in Afghanistan and Cameroon. And the research question for that was to understand the protection risks and barriers that arise in the targeting, delivery and use of cash in cash programming for socio-economically vulnerable populations in conflict-affected settings. So it's not just targeting women, but vulnerable populations in a more protracted crisis settings. So we did that research largely with vulnerable women, so for example, younger women, older women, female heads of households, women with limited mobility, as well as vulnerable men. And we wanted to understand the barriers and the risks that they potentially could be exposed to by participating in the cash programme. What was stopping them from receiving the cash? What could we change to make sure it's safer? But also, as Karen says, were there any risks that we were actually exacerbating any of the risks that they were exposed to? Again, that research is underway. We're at the early stages of that. So just to summarise, what we'll do with that information is develop a safer cash toolkit. The questions that we looked at in particular were the protection risks when accessing cash at various levels, at the individual level, the household level, community level and social level. The barriers, as I said, design preferences of cash recipients, so understanding really what it was that they encountered that was challenging. And so when it comes to considering how to modify our programming, as I said, we'll develop a safer cash toolkit, but we'll also think more, and this will inform the flexibility around our distribution that we already take into consideration when designing programs. You know, that will include the duration of the cash, the location that people collect the cash in, so you know, whether that's in the home or in a central place, depending on the context and the preferences, the amount of cash received and the frequency. And I've come to time, so I'll pause there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daphne. Tenzin from Women's Refugee, I just want to say committee.
Everyone does. All right, given the time allowance, I'm just going to jump straight in. So efforts to prevent and respond to gender-based violence should be a priority for all actors in all humanitarian response operations from the very start. We're often missing the boat on this, I would say more often than not. When we do this, we fulfill our collective responsibility to do no harm, but we also establish an essential building block of gender equality. The evidence on cash and GBV is nascent and mixed, as has been discussed. Cash itself is not inherently riskier than any other kind of humanitarian assistance, but without considering the gender dynamics, imbalanced access to and control over resources, recipients may face associated risks. These risks vary based on context, age, gender, and diversity. With respect to gender, I'm not only referring to women and girls here. The scope and scale of GBV does disproportionately affect women and girls in conflict and displacement settings, but it's also incredibly high risk for LGBTI individuals, and some men and boys also systematically experience violence in the face of violent masculinity. So we need to be thinking about gender more broadly than women and girls alone, and GBV prevention and response more broadly than women and girls alone. Cash and GBV prevention and response practitioners need to work together to build the evidence required to optimize cash-based interventions for protection from gender-based violence. The Women's Refugee Commission recently completed a 17-month action research project in February with funding from the United States Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. This research was to assess how cash and GBV programming are currently integrated in humanitarian settings. We conducted a desk review, interviews with many of you in the room, cash, gender, GBV experts across 20 different agencies, and we conducted field missions with partners who are also in the room, ADESO, IRC, Mercy Corps Save, in Somalia, Jordan, and Niger, respectively. I want to share with you today, quickly, key findings from our research. So first, while there's been some progress on cash and protection, the next frontier is really cash and GBV programming. Some institutionalization efforts have been taking place of best guidance. There's nascent practice, but momentum is building. We need to ride that wave, and I'm happy to be in the room with many of you today building that momentum. One key issue is that cash and GBV actors are siloed in agencies and across communities of practice. This siloing impedes clarity on roles and responsibilities, conducting new research, development of successful approaches, effective coordination efforts, and using human and financial resources to the best of our abilities. There's anxiety about integrating cash and GBV programming, which inhibits the skills building and evidence building that's needed to move forward. There's more buy-in for mainstreaming GBV in cash programming than using cash for protection outcomes and cash for GBV outcomes in particular. One key obstacle is common understanding of the others domain, that cash and GBV actors, cash and gender actors are often unfamiliar with the others approach. So it's great that we can have events like this where we teach each other. In terms of cash for protection outcomes, there's a hesitancy to conduct action research and protective pilots, and this is rationalized as doing no harm. If we don't know how to do it properly, we shouldn't do it. We should do it very carefully, but we need to move forward. When we're not addressing the economic drivers of GBV with cash assistance where it's appropriate, we may be doing harm. There are resource gaps, including staffing and donor funding. As funding for humanitarian crises globally reduce, the prioritization of research on cash and GBV is also less prioritized. We need longer-term project horizons, sufficient staffing to address caseloads, longer duration cash assistance in particular to meet the needs of GBV survivors. Despite best practice, poor practice is persistent and undercuts the potential of cash. As colleagues have discussed, gender analysis is often omitted or perhaps doesn't translate into program design. There's a persistence of one-size-fits-all programming, despite understanding that cash needs to be tailored to meet specific needs and to ensure protection. And we're often missing opportunities to pair cash with complementary services. So we need to be looking at what does cash plus look like, and I look forward to discussing this with you all this afternoon. It's also common that GBV referral pathways are either unestablished or underutilized, and this goes back to capacity building of different teams of the others' referral pathways. So there's also a gap in practical resources to assess and monitor programming to make sure that programming is, on the one hand, doing no harm, and also to be able to measure reduction in risk when cash is being utilized for protection outcomes. The Women's Refugee Commission, Mercy Corps, and IRC have a new toolkit to help address these gaps. Working together, cash and GBV practitioners can coordinate to enhance their individual and collective impact. But there's many questions that are still unanswered. Among these, how do the delivery mechanism, frequency, duration, and value of cash transfers impact protection and gender outcomes? What kinds of cash plus programming are most effective to positively impact protection, gender dynamics, and challenge negative gender roles in different humanitarian settings? There needs to be more research done in more settings, done by more agencies. I want to speak very quickly to current research that WRC is undertaking in collaboration with IRC and CaLP and the London School of Economics to map evidence on cash for GBV outcomes. This is still underway, but quickly I'll share some findings. There are a few studies overall on cash for GBV outcomes, but these are concentrated geographically in sub-Saharan Africa, which points the need for more studies across more geographies and different humanitarian settings. There's more evidence around certain GBV outcomes than others. There's more documented around household decision-making and IPV, for example, than around cash related to protection outcomes like reducing early forced marriage and improving asset ownership and control. Multi-purpose cash grants are often deployed with mixed outcomes, and there's recognition that cash plus results in primarily positive outcomes, but there's still questions about what exactly that should look like. And as Karen mentioned earlier, there is a tendency to arbitrarily target women without consulting communities as to what's most appropriate. So here's a little taste of what's coming. I'm ready to stop. Thank you, colleagues. So look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Jenny, over to you, and even you don't know what your acronym stands for, so I feel no guilt this time.
Thank you very much.
Just go ahead.
Cool. So my name is Jenny Caswell, and I work on the research and insights for the Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Programme at the GSMA. I'm going to approach this topic from an entirely different perspective, just to complicate things even further. And that is thinking about the component that I think is often left out of this conversation on cash and gender, and that's the role of mobile technology. both for the delivery of cash aid, but also as an enabler for long-term livelihood opportunities, such as financial inclusion. So as cash transfers are increasingly digitised, for example by using mobile money to deliver cash aid, we really need to prioritise research around understanding the implications, both good and bad, for gender-based assistance. So although this digital modality adds an additional complexity to the conversation, I think it's something that really shouldn't be overlooked. And I'm going to share with you why this is important and give you a bit of a flavour about the research that we've been doing at the GSMA and the priorities for future research. So, for those of you, probably most people in the room who don't know who the GSMA are, we're the trade association for mobile network operators, and we represent the interests of over 800 mobile operators globally. And today there are over 5 billion mobile subscribers. 3.8 billion of those are in low and middle income countries. And this is why we have a Mobile for Development programme at the GSMA, which is funded by DFID. A segment of it is funded by DFID, and the overall objective is to improve the lives of people who are underserved by using mobile technology in a commercially sustainable way when and where it makes sense. So the programme that I focus the research on is Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation, and our overall objective is to accelerate the digitisation of humanitarian assistance. We focus on 5 thematic areas that are all interdependent and are all equally important in trying to develop a digital ecosystem for people in humanitarian contexts. For the sake of this conversation today, I'll just be focusing on mobile financial services and gender and inclusivity. Next slide, please. So, for those of you who may be less familiar with maybe some of the opportunities presented by mobile technology, it has the proximity to populations who are usually in very rural areas and are hard to reach, especially in humanitarian contexts. And it also, using mobile money for cash aid, has the potential for financial inclusion and long-term livelihood opportunities. But although mobile is spreading very rapidly, it's not spreading evenly, and women are often left behind. We have lots of research at the GSMA from our Connected Women programme that shows there is a huge digital gender gap, and they have sized this gap in low and middle income countries, but there's still a dearth of evidence in the humanitarian context, and that's where the research that we're doing is prioritising and trying to understand what that gap is, what the barriers are for mobile access in those areas. So the future research, and just to point out that this is a huge problem when it comes to the humanitarian sector, because if these programs are being targeted at women and we don't really understand what the barriers are to access and usage of mobile technologies, we need to do more research to kind of strengthen the evidence base. So future research will try to understand what the disproportionate barriers are to mobile for women, but also understand what the disproportionate advantages could be once women have access to mobile. Next slide, please. So the Connected Women team did some research and quantified the persistent gender gap in low and middle income countries. They found that in these countries, women are 10% less likely to own a mobile phone than men, and the gap increases for more transformational services like mobile internet. So women are 26% less likely to use mobile internet than men. And Findex also found that for mobile money, this gap is 33%. So there are obviously country variations, and if you're interested in those countries specifically, please do look at the research online. But I think this has really important implications for when we think about how to do programming in the humanitarian sector. We go to the next slide. The really interesting outcomes of this research were to identify 5 areas where women faced the main barriers to access for mobile phones. And so the first was accessibility. Just that entry point is very difficult for women. If you think women are less likely to have an identification that they can have access to a SIM card with, or then be able to pass KYC for mobile money, they are maybe more likely to stay in their house and mobile coverage doesn't expand, have access in their house. The second one is affordability. So we found that across the board, affordability is a bigger issue for women than it is for men. Usability and skills. once women have access to a phone and it's affordable, how do we ensure that they can actually use these services for the long term? So links to financial inclusion, digital inclusion, how can we, through humanitarian programming, ensure that this can happen? Safety and security, this obviously safety can be a risk for women, this inhibits their usage of phones, but also it can be an enabler. There's evidence to show that mobile money going into, so CaLP going into a mobile money account, because it's more discreet, women will feel safer. And then finally, relevance. So we need to ensure that policies, content, products and services are as relevant to men as they are to women. And then the next slide. So our Connected Women programme work with mobile operators to try and reduce this gender gap for mobile internet and mobile money. There are a whole range of initiatives that mobile operators do, but I think these are things that humanitarian organisations can partner with the private sector on to ensure that the outcomes of these cash transfer programming systems can kind of be enhanced. So one example is that mobile operators are recruiting female agents to ensure that female customers feel safer when transacting with mobile money. Another example is how mobile operators are developing digital financial services that are very well aligned to traditional women's savings groups. So it really kind of encourages women to use some of these products in the long term. And then finally, next slide, is about the priority research areas for the future. So these first two are the ones I've spoken about, and we are looking at how we can reduce this gender gap in humanitarian context specifically. We're doing research in Jordan, Rwanda and Uganda next month, and the results will be out in January. We're also looking at user experiences, particularly women, for how they receive cash via mobile money specifically. And finally, longer term research efforts need to focus on what the linkages are towards this financial inclusion for the long term. So sorry, I think I went over. That's okay.
5 minutes, that's fine. Thank you very much. Daphne, I'm going to suggest you should go around. And over to you, our participants. What questions do you have? What do you want to find out more about? What's your curiosity? Who'd like to go first? Please.
So my question is, have any of the research that you described looked at the causality of risks related to gender, but also to protection? I mean, I think if I understood well, if I remember well, IRC's research was looking at prevention. However, my understanding of the research, of your research, is that you're just looking at not increasing the violence that perhaps already exists. So is there any probing on causality of risks? Why certain masculinities, for example, manifest in a violent way at the household level, and a reduction of these risks?
Great question.
So with regards to the two pieces of research that I mentioned, that isn't a dimension of that research, but I wouldn't say that isn't, that I would say confidently that that is an element of research from our Violence Prevention and Response Unit colleagues, where we understand the gender dynamics in play, the root causes of GBV. But I think the point you made about the reality of siloed GBV cash people is something that we are trying to overcome, and this is an example where we're doing that with the GBV research. But nevertheless, I think, yes, all of these questions need to be understood in the context of what are the causes. And the What Works research is much bigger than this cash component. So,
would any of the other panelists like to add to that? Person at the back, and then man in the grey jumper.
Thanks. So great presentations, thank you. A few of you mentioned that the research and evidence in this sector is nascent and mixed and still a little inconclusive. Given kind of that state of play, what are your recommendations for INGOs now to program effectively using cash to empower women to reduce GBV? Beyond kind of the recommendation that we do more research. Do you want to start?
Sure. I think it's really important that we're all capturing learning. Something that Karen mentioned earlier was that there's a dearth of evidence and we weren't sure that people would have papers to put forward. I think it's really important that we capture practice sometimes that is within perhaps one country operation but not being shared with others within one organization and then more broadly within and across communities of practice. So first is to capture and share learning. And then in terms of the toolkit that I mentioned before, there are tools to assess potential risks associated with cash, as well as tools to monitor those perceived risks during the implementation of cash assistance to inform adaptation in planning as needed. So it's really to take those on board. They're intended to be adaptable to different contexts. They're available in different languages, will be available thanks to CARE in other languages shortly. So it's really to utilize the guidance and tools that are out there to capture and share learning.
Just to add to that, I think it's important as well that we understand the potential for cash as well, not just how to minimise the risk or how to achieve GBV outcomes, but cash across outcomes, and that's certainly something that the IRC is considering. But as I said, also the transformative impact, like what can cash do for household decision making, for instance? What can cash do to achieve empowerment outcomes as well as GBV outcomes?
And from our side, I think something that is often missing from the conversation and from research that we see is the delivery mechanism that is used. Although people on the ground have a clear idea of what that delivery mechanism was, this changes between contexts, and it's really difficult to understand what that has actually been and then understand what the implications of that are. If that was captured better from each different program that each different NGO did, I think it would be easier to consolidate and distill some of the kind of lessons a bit more broadly. Thank you.
This is mostly for Daphne, and mainly referring to your the example you provided of Raqqa City, but I think the challenges that we and you and others are facing there are kind of apply elsewhere in multiple other contexts, particularly in terms of the kind of practical challenges of gathering this kind of data. And I wondered, one of the challenges that we face is this risk of kind of death by questionnaire of our beneficiaries and other households, and how we can mitigate that when there isn't necessarily a direct link between the information we're gathering, whether it be around gender or other aspects that we as institutions are rightly prioritising. When we've already done a baseline and needs assessment and an end line including multiple other questions around other topics, how can we overcome and prioritise gender within multiple competing agendas within end-line studies and research, particularly when it's post-haste, when it's after assistance has been provided and people are, in many cases, simply sick and tired of answering the questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with us, actually mainstreaming gender into our research approaches. I'd welcome thoughts from others in the room on that. I think we thought very carefully about the exact point you're making about exposing respondents to risks by, any risk of creating stigma associated with them responding to that, or trauma, or or underreporting being one of them. And we tried to get around that using technology, and that was sort of a way that we thought that through in advance. But I would like to see all of our research having a gender-sensitive approach to it, beyond beyond it being research about gender or about gender outcomes. We should be considering those risks and those opportunities across our research. I'd really love to hear from others on that. It's a good question.
Yeah, I think maybe at another level that question could also be thinking more about how we can consolidate programming generally so that one recipient isn't receiving cash from multiple people, and then there's the need for research to assess that. So maybe the problem is that there are too many different siloed approaches to giving cash, and there should be a more kind of overarching program that can give different cash for different things to one beneficiary and then capturing the M&E from that. But we certainly struggle with that issue as well around, that's why we're really, really careful not to duplicate research that's already happened and asking the same beneficiaries the same questions time and again. We work really closely with our humanitarian partners and UNHCR, specifically in refugee camps, to understand what data is already out there and where the real gaps are.
Yeah, very, very quickly, I think one enabling factor is breaking down those silos, right? So if I'm a cash person, you're a gender person, or vice versa, and we do understand the other person's domain and methodology a little bit more, I think there's going to be more of an inclination and bandwidth to harmonize, assessments, evaluations, etc. at the appropriate time, which then has the knock-on effect of less burden for our populations of concern and that never-ending questioning, right? So one thing, food for thought.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you. My name is Maria Turin. I'm representing the Swedish government, Sweden. So I have a question on the estimation of 6 million people that I think you said could be reached through digital transfers. Was that, when is that, is it a prediction or is it what can be reached today? Or to me it sounded a little bit not, it didn't sound like a enormous number of people considering how many people are affected by humanitarian crisis. So I'm wondering, is that an estimation of today, or do you have also an estimation, let's say, in 2 years or in 5 years or something like that?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. I don't think I said 6 million. I said that there are over 5 billion mobile subscribers in the world.
Yes.
And in low and middle income countries, there are 3.8 billion. So I was talking about the fact that there is this penetration, very high penetration of mobile technology, and therefore there's huge potential to deliver cash via mobile money, for example. So once someone has a phone, then they can often then have access to a mobile money account, which in many of these circumstances is used for the delivery of that cash. So the potential is huge, but my point was that there is a digital gender divide, and we need to tackle that to ensure that when we're programming targeting women, we ensure that these women can actually access the cash and use their mobile money account for longer term livelihood outcomes.
Okay, thank you. So the 6 million was just something that you didn't have that reference in your presentation.
I don't think so.
Okay, sorry.
But always good to check. Please, can I just ask for a clarification? You mentioned, I think, 3 or 4 countries at the end of your presentation that research will start next month to be finalized with findings in January. Is it the same methodology that you mentioned, the gender mobile, or is it something else?
That's a really good question. So we have a consumer survey that we do at the GSMA, and that is the data that's used for the gender gap. We're using the same questions around what the barriers are to mobile. So the methodology is on the whole very similar, and we'll have 1,000 surveys in each country to ensure that the evidence is robust enough to make these claims about the digital gender gap. So yes and no, but the data will be comparable.
Which are the new countries?
So we'll be doing this, so the countries for the low and middle income countries is just in a development context, but this new research will actually look in humanitarian context. So in Rwanda, it will look at a refugee camp in the west. In Uganda, it will be in Bidi settlement in the north, and in Jordan, it will be in an urban environment with urban refugees.
Please.
Since there's no other questions. So my question actually is, because when you were talking about who's here at the tables, I mean, there's cash, there's gender, there's umbrellas that don't necessarily fit in one, and it's the whole social protection role that goes beyond just the humanitarian, right? Or,
Sure.
So my question is, in the research that these institutions are undertaking, is there any direct linkages? Because I've heard the words of sustainability, of livelihoods, of long-term, like all those words embedded in some of the research. So my question is in linking cash transfers are all linked to the social protection as like first building blocks towards inclusive social protection schemes, and particularly in humanitarian contexts that have long protracted sort of crisis going on. What are the linkages between the humanitarian context and the gender interventions, right, and the more sort of long-term social protection plans or interventions, if there is anything of that sort in the research that you're undertaking?
So I wouldn't say necessarily in the research that I was describing, but I think that's the link between social protection systems and emergency humanitarian cash transfers is something we've sort of explored in other research we've done in Pakistan, and we've done that by understanding how social protection systems can be leveraged to deliver cash faster, basically. By using social protection data. So we use the Benazir Income Support Scheme data to compare with community-based targeting methods as what we have done, and we've sped up cash delivery significantly by doing that. So that's research where we've understood how social protection systems can be leveraged. I think you're asking a question that's more about the kind of role that cash plays in achieving potentially gender outcomes or recognising gender in longer term responses. And I think that is something we're thinking about in terms of our economic programming being about cash and livelihoods and agriculture and so on. But and I think all of our livelihoods programming has a cash dimension to it. You know, that'll be as in terms of a business grant or a stipend, or there'll always be a cash dimension. And what we know is, what all of us know, is that none of these situations are tidy, linear contexts where you can move from cash and go to a system of like jobs and then everybody's resettled, it's all fine. Like, you know, you go back and forth from people will experience shocks and actually they'll need cash where they've embarked on a livelihood program. So understanding the experiences of women and girls in those contexts is really important, and it's something that's on our mind as we think about a more overarching approach to economic programming.
Does anyone want to complete that? Yeah.
Hi, I actually just wanted to build on that a little bit further because so my name's Fiona and I'm in the Women's Economic Empowerment and Policy team at CARE. And I'm quite interested in the nexus between cash and livelihood development, so that's a development bridge. And a piece of research that we've just done was to look at savings groups as potentially that bridge, potentially. They're something that supports women to have access to savings and loans. But we were really surprised when we did this research with that's coming out next year. We did it with FSC Africa, UKAid and the Seed Network and some others. And we actually realised that governments across Africa are promoting savings groups through their social protection schemes, particularly safety nets. So there's about 5 national programs. So I just wanted to sort of share that finding without any idea of how this can actually work in a really humanitarian context, but that it is interesting, it is evidence, it is sort of research, and we are so many experts here on cash that I thought would be quite interesting to learn how potentially this could reach more people through that sort of cash and livelihood growth nexus. So a bit of a question, a bit of a comment, and hopefully lots of ideas.
Fantastic. Does anyone want to respond to that, an initial thought?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area of research and we're certainly looking into it as well. Thinking about how in more protracted crises, mobile technology can also be an enabler once cash is delivered into a mobile money account. What are all of the other ways that someone could use mobile technology for other livelihood opportunities? So it's kind of, it's obviously mobile technology is by no means the answer, but it is an enabler for all of these other types of things. And I think that looking at traditional women's savings groups is one really exciting way of doing this, and potentially thinking about how humanitarian organisations could even deliver cash into a shared account, mobile money account between women, and how they can use that areas like savings, loans, insurance, and all of these other longer-term financial inclusion benefits that we focus on in research more broadly, more in a development context. But I think we have lots of lessons to learn that from the humanitarian context we can kind of drive forward to a more developmental outcome.
Please.
Just a reflection on that. I think as we go forward on this, we have to be super careful that we do draw from the kind of the gender thinking and analysis that's coming out of social protection and longer term development space, and use that as a steer for what we understand in emergency context, but careful not to apply it in absolute, because those dynamics change profoundly. So it might give us a little bit of an indication of what's going on, but I've been a little bit concerned a few times lately where I've seen people quoting actually what's gender issues and gender cash transfers from social protection programs, and they're talking about it as if it works in an emergency space, and there's no evidence that it necessarily follows through with the same pattern. So I think we have to be careful as these sort of areas are coming together. It's great, let's learn and look at what's there, but let's also check the robustness of whether that still applies.
But I would also say that in savings groups, they're 80% female, and there's these sort of community-driven platforms to address GBV in other areas, and that when that links to social protection, that is a. So I take your point.
Massive opportunity.
It is with considering it already has a strong gender lens.
Yeah.
Right, yes.
Yeah, more of a comment, I suppose, but curious to know what people in the room think. There was a report released a few months ago by the Women's Budget Group in the UK about universal credit in the UK and financial abuse. And what they seem to be saying, early research seemed to suggest that the rolling together of different cash grants given through the UK's welfare system into universal credit, or one multi-purpose payout, if you will, seemed to increase vulnerabilities for certain groups, particularly women. And in particular, they were talking about women in relationships where there was existing financial abuse happening. And I wondered whether anybody has done any research on multi-purpose cash grants as a particular type of cash grant, and whether or not there is any emerging evidence of whether or not that makes a difference, or whether we just don't know.
Good question. Does anyone have the answer?
I think that we don't know.
Yes.
The evidence mapping that I mentioned before, which we're in process of doing, there's not really enough evidence across different kinds of transfers to be able to come to a conclusion. So I think that's a huge part of it, is we need to have more research not only on cash for different GBV outcomes and have more evidence around what does it mean for reduction of early marriage, for example, etc. But also to look at the modality of assistance as well.
Final question. Oh, go ahead.
Actually, UNHCR has done research in 2018 on multi-purpose cash and sectoral outcomes. So I think it's a public good. It's available online, so perhaps you can have a look. I think the tentative conclusions are that at least for protection as a sector, there has to be a complementary programming, and as said, a number of criteria to be fulfilled in order to achieve a longer-term protection outcome. And of course you'll find data for other sectors as well.
Fantastic. Do you want to add to that?
It's a different topic, if I may. But
You may, but this will be the last one.
okay, it's a big one, so
Oh, Lord.
I'll ask the question and then you decide whether it's
Please.
fine. I'm just interested that we're all aware of the general push towards cash at scale, and also an increasing drive from certain donors towards emphasising cost efficiency. And I just wonder, one, whether there's any research ongoing, and two, just the views of the panellists around whether those two agendas are kind of competitive with the gender agenda. What I have in my mind, in my very simple mind, is that cash at scale, you tend to lose nuance, and nuance for me includes elements of gender, as well as the increasing kind of infringement on costs for M&E and for additional supportive processes that might enhance gender mainstreaming within cash. So for me, it's an inherent threat, but I wonder if it's exclusively so, and if there's also potential in cash at scale as a new thing, or relatively new thing, to incorporate gender more forcefully and more strongly than in previous cash approaches.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, and something that's being discussed a lot, or what we're losing by a move to value for money or cost efficiency, or a drive for cost efficiency, what we're losing in terms of nuance and context appropriateness, and that's something that's being considered a lot by the work pillar of the Grand Bargain cash work stream on cost efficiency and effectiveness in humanitarian assistance that IRC is leading with USAID. I think we need to be cautious of how we measure efficiency and what we incentivise by virtue of that measure. So, for example, if we're looking at the cost transfer ratio, that is minimising what might be loosely described as overheads. Well, those overheads will include a gender risk assessment, gender sensitivity approach, and those are cost intensive. Doing it right isn't free. It costs money. And so, what are we losing by a move to value for money in these terms, and what are the risks of a push to cost efficiency?
Thank you. I'd like everybody in the audience to thank our panellists